Okay, this is video 2 for lesson 2. We're going to continue on with the brain, and we're going to get through the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum in this video. So last video we talked about the cerebral hemispheres, including the cerebral cortex, which is our thought, memory, logic, voluntary skeletal muscle movements. Then we went deeper into the white matter, which is where signals can enter and exit into the cerebral cortex. And then we talked about basal nuclei, which help modify skeletal muscle movements like starting and stopping. So here is the diencephalon. This is also called the interbrain. And this is going to be basically on top of the brainstem, and it's going to be deep to the cerebral hemispheres. So it's actually going to be deeper kind of inside of those cerebral hemispheres. And this is going to be called the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. Those are the three big structures that we're going to talk about. So if we look here, this area that I'm circling is all part of the diencephalon. So this is the part that we're going to focus on. So up here is the cerebral hemispheres that we talked about. This really cool structure is that corpus callosum, that remembers that major fiber tract that connects the left and the right cerebral hemispheres. So right now we're going to focus deeper than the cerebral hemispheres and on this area here. So the thalamus is going to be the first thing that we talk about. And really, this is kind of a relay station for impulses that are going up into the sensory cortex. So what this kind of means is this is the area of the brain that's going to basically tell you if what you are feeling is a pleasant or unpleasant sensation. So it may not be able to say this is painful or this is cold or this is hot, but it's going to say what we're feeling right now doesn't feel good. And then when it gets up into your sensory cortex, that's when you're going to be able to recognize what type of painful or unpleasant sensation it is. Then we have the hypothalamus, which is going to be underneath the hypothalamus. Anytime you see hypo, it means less or under. So this is going to be right underneath the hypothalamus, and this is an extremely important structure. It's really important for your autonomic nervous system, which, remember, autonomic sounds like automatic. So these are things that you don't have to worry about, like your water balance or temperature. The hypothalamus is often called the thermostat of the body because it's really able to control your body temperature. It's also a very important center for drives and emotions, and we call this part of the limbic system. And there's some other structures of the limbic system that we're not super going to get into, like the amygdala, but just know that the limbic system is really important for drives and emotions, and this is thirst or appetite, sex, pain, and pleasure. That's all these kind of drives and emotions. Something kind of really interesting to point out here is the diencephalon and the brainstem are often known as our old brain, and the cerebral hemispheres are known as your new brain because they evolved later on in our history. So this old brain, this diencephalon and the brainstem, we find in a lot of animals that are less complex than us because they need to have these certain things in order to survive. This is our kind of survival brain. We need to be able to have sex and reproduce. We need to be able to understand when we're thirsty or when we need to eat. These are all things that are survival instincts, where the cerebral hemispheres are, art and logic and memory and reasoning and problem solving. Those aren't things that you necessarily need to survive, where these older centers are really that old brain because they're driving your instincts. Another really important thing about the hypothalamus is it's connected to what's called the pituitary gland. And when we get into our lessons on the endocrine system, the pituitary gland is your master endocrine gland, and it's controlled by this hypothalamus. The pituitary gland produces many different hormones, and the hypothalamus itself actually produces two hormones that basically regulate that pituitary gland. We also have mammillary bodies that are attached to the bottom of the hypothalamus, and this helps with your smell. So I wanted to just show you here, this is your pituitary gland, and it's connected to this hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus really is an extremely important structure for maintaining many different autonomic impulses. Okay, then we have the epithalamus. That's our last. Notice they all have thalamus in them, so it's kind of easy to remember all those structures of the diencephalon. And the epithalamus contains two really important structures. One's called the pineal gland, which is part of the endocrine system. It actually helps you with sleep, so there's the pineal gland right there. And then it contains the choroid plexus. The choroid plexus is literally a huge capillary bed that helps to form cerebrospinal fluid. And remember, that fluid is constantly flowing around the brain and the spinal cord to protect it. So this is where it's made, is in this choroid plexus. Okay, so that was your diencephalon. Now we're going to move into the brainstem. The brainstem is approximately 3 inches long, and it's going to be right below that diencephalon, and it's going to contain 3 very important structures: your midbrain, your pons, and then the medulla oblongata. So the midbrain is the smallest part of the brainstem, and it contains a few important structures. One is the corpora quadrigemina. These are your reflex centers for vision and hearing, so they're going to can be able to send those impulses to the correct centers. And then you also have cerebral peduncles, and these are just going to be fiber tracts, and you're going to notice this kind of about the brainstem is they're all going to contain fiber tracts. And remember, tracts are going to be that thicker white matter that's going to be able to bring information up and down the spinal cord and up into the diencephalon and the cerebral hemispheres. All right, so if we look here, here is our first section, that midbrain. Shows you right there the corpora quadrigemina, one of the major structures. So this is going to be your most superior structure for your brainstem. Then we have the pons, which is right below the midbrain. Okay, so here's your pons here. And what's kind of cool is when you do brain dissections, if the brain you got contains the brainstem, the pons is really easy to see because it does bulge out so much. And this is basically just a whole bunch of fiber tracts for bringing information up and down the brainstem. And it also helps to control your breathing. Then we have the medulla oblongata. Very, very, very important structure once again in that autonomic nervous system. It's a lot of fiber tracts and it merges with the spinal cord, but we have so many activities that are controlled by this medulla oblongata, like your heart rate, your blood pressure, the ability to swallow, vomiting, and breathing. Once again, these are all things that you must have to survive and be alive. Think about how important it is to maintain blood pressure. Okay, super important. If your blood pressure gets too low, you go into shock and you likely will die in minutes. Even vomiting, very, very important reflex that we have to have. If you're choking on something, if you ate something that's poisonous, the ability for your body to recognize that you need to vomit that's a huge, huge thing. Okay, we also have just a little tiny other structure I want to talk about called the reticular formation. And this is really interesting. It actually runs the entire length of the brainstem, and it helps with motor control of your visceral organs. So that would be like your heart beating, for example. And it also is really important for our sleep cycles. So it kind of will let you know when you should be awake and when you should be asleep. And it also gives you that feeling of consciousness. And damage to this area can cause people to often go into a coma or a deep sleep that they are unable to wake up from. And this is your reticular formation back here. So it runs the entire length of the brain stem. All right, our last structure of the brain we're going to talk about is the cerebellum. It does look like a big piece of cauliflower, so if you've ever eaten cauliflower, that's exactly what it looks like. It sits right underneath the occipital lobe, and it's often called the little brain. And the reason it's called the little brain is it's got two separate hemispheres, and it also contains a kind of cortex area and a white matter deep to it. So there's your cerebellum. It's underneath your occipital lobe right there. And when you cut it open, it's so cool looking. Here's your the cortex of the cerebellum. You can kind of trace it out, and then you can see it's got the white matter deep to it. Very cool. I think it kind of also looks like a tree root system. So what does our cerebellum do? Very, very important for balance, coordination, and equilibrium. Extremely important for all of those things, and it's highly affected by alcohol. And if you've ever seen somebody who's intoxicated, they're often walking, kind of swerving and not able to maintain their balance. And that's why if you get pulled over when you've been drinking, the cops will often ask you to stand on one leg or walk in a straight line, because it's very hard to have balance and equilibrium when your cerebellum isn't working correctly. I had a patient one time, I worked in a physical therapy clinic for many years, and I had a patient, and this is one patient I'll never forget. He was probably in his 40s, and he had a tumor on his cerebellum, and when they removed it, it obviously affected his cerebellum, but it was a cancerous tumor. They had to remove it. And his balance and coordination just when walking was extremely difficult. So we focused on activities that really pushed him to try to get this equilibrium back so that he was just able to walk without having to swerve kind of all over the place. All right. The last thing we're going to talk about in this video is the protection of the central nervous system, and then in video 3 we'll go through the spinal cord. So your brain and spinal cord are two of the most important organs. They control everything. So we're going to kind of go through the layers of protection that surround the brain and the spinal cord. Obviously you have your skin on the outside, but then you have your skull and your vertebral column that are going to kind of be the ultimate first protectors. They're super, super hard. They're bone. So that's going to be able to support and surround the brain and the spinal cord. But then deeper to the skull and the vertebral column is going to be what's called meninges. And the meninges are very tough connective tissue that surround the brain and spinal cord. And they come in 3 layers: the dura, arachnoid, and pia. The dura is going to be your outermost, arachnoid is the middle, and then the pia is the one that's actually going to be touching the brain. So your dura mater is very, very tough and hard. It's your outermost layer. It almost has a leathery feel to it, and it really does. When you dissect brains, you can definitely see the dura mater. And the arachnoid mater is your middle layer, and they named it arachnoid because it literally does kind of look like a cobweb. And then your innermost layer is the pia mater, and this is what's actually touching the brain and spinal cord. It's clinging to the outside of it. So if we look here it goes through all your layers. You have your skin, then you have your bone, then you're going to have your dura mater, your arachnoid mater, and then your pia mater, which is actually going to be touching the cerebral cortex. And you can see, here's your arachnoid mater. It totally does look like a spider web. You also have cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid is really important. It's formed by the choroid plexus. It contains some vitamin and nutrients, but really it's really important for protecting and cushioning against a blow, and it's constantly flowing around the brain and the spinal cord. So we're finishing up here. This is just the last picture showing you that your cerebral spinal fluid is constantly being moved around the brain and the spinal cord to protect it. All right, so we're going to stop there and we'll continue.